Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to look at answering the question, why is inflation so low in Australia and around the world? And I'm not going to give you the answers. Today we're going to go to an expert. So hold on, let's get started. So in answering the question, why is inflation so low in Australia and around the world, we're going to consult the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Dr. Philip Lowe. Now, in late July, Dr. Lowe gave a speech to the Annika Foundation. Links will be in the description. And his speech was really focused around inflation and inflation targeting. It's an excellent speech. We're going to go through some of the key elements, but I do recommend you have a bit of a read. Okay, so what was interesting was that Dr. Lowe started out by talking about when he studied economics. And he said when he studied economics 40 years ago, the problems were high inflation and high unemployment. And now, 40 years later, the key problem is low inflation, low, persistent, subdued inflation in Australia and in economies around the world. So Dr. Lowe looked at this and he said, why is inflation so low globally and in Australia? And you can see here from this graph 2, world inflation year ended, all these years down the bottom. And you can see here that core and headline have been steadily falling. That, look at that, it's probably around about 2.5% in terms of world inflation. So going back to when he studied economics and to when we are studying economics now, as of August 2019, the inflation situation is very different. Indeed, as the governor says, and this might be a quote you want to use, low inflation has become the norm in most economies. So low inflation is just the standard situation in most economies. So if we're thinking about why inflation is so low, Dr. Lowe gives us three reasons to consider. So the first reason why inflation is so low in Australia and around the world is because of what he calls the credibility of monetary frameworks. Now this sounds a bit confusing, this is very much economic speak, but we can decipher it. So what Dr. Lowe is saying is he's saying that because of the success of central banks around the world in setting inflation targets, people act in a way that will keep inflation low. Let me explain a little bit more. In the 70s and 80s in Australia and around the world, there were big inflation breakouts. Prices were soaring, inflation was out of control. So what happened was governments and central banks decided to set targets for inflation. They said that we're going to act to ensure that inflation stays low within this range over the course of the business cycle. So then people and businesses started to understand that if inflation got too high, the central bank would bring it down again. So then people and firms act in a way that then keeps inflation low because of the success of inflation targets. So that central banks are acting to keep inflation low, and people, they know that if they ask for higher wage rises and the price wages spiral start, they know that the central banks will then increase interest rates, slow the economy, and inflation will come down and they're back to where they started. So this is the first reason why inflation is low. This is the credibility of monetary frameworks. So reason number 2 is what Dr. Lowe calls spare capacity. Well, he talks about spare capacity. He didn't invent this term. It's an economics term that you're probably familiar with. What Dr. Lowe is talking about here is that aggregate demand is weak. Aggregate demand is weak globally in Australia, and there is a lot of spare capacity. There's a lot of resources that could be used, but are just sitting idle. So what it means is that if firms do need some extra workers, well, they can just bring some of this spare capacity on board. So let's look at the other situation. If aggregate demand is pretty weak at the moment in Australia and around the world, what would happen if aggregate demand was strong? Well, what would happen was there would be increased demand for workers, and that there would be existing workers would be given more hours. All of this would reduce the amount of spare capacity. This would put upward pressure on wages because firms need those extra workers, which would increase prices and increase inflation. So stronger aggregate demand leads to higher inflation. Weaker aggregate demand leads to lower inflation because of that spare capacity. And that's what Australia has got at the moment, along with economies around the world. Another thing to think about that Dr. Lowe talked about, and I'll put up a graph here to help us understand this concept. Why does Australia have so much spare capacity? And what Dr. Lowe talked about is it's because Australia's participation rate has gone up quite substantially, that more people have been encouraged to look for work, and this has kept wages and inflation low. So as we're seeing in this graph, that the RBA thought that the participation rate would go down towards 64.5%. Instead, it's gone towards 66%. So more people looking for work, higher rates of unemployment, greater spare capacity, lower pressure on wages and inflation. Okay, so that's reason number 2. Can you see here I've got my notes on my Harvard Graduate School of Education paper, just a small flex, but a flex nonetheless. So the third reason why Dr. Lowe says inflation has remained low is because of globalization and improvements in technology, which have resulted in lower prices. So let's talk about this in 2 ways. Firstly, greater improvements in technology have led to lower production costs, greater efficiencies, more productivity, which has reduced production costs and reduced prices, therefore put downward pressure on inflation, right? So better technology, it's just cheaper and faster to produce things. The other thing is in terms of globalization, that the ability of companies and products to move, even services to move and be sold all around the world, has increased competition. For example, in Australia these days, you can physically go into stores of Uniqlo, Topshop, no more Topshop, H&M, Zara, all of these stores that didn't exist in Australia before. So you've got more stores, more competition, greater pressure on prices, greater pushing down of prices. So let me show you this graph that Dr. Lowe used, and we can go through that. So you can see here it's advanced economies, core inflation. You can see services and goods, there's been downward pressure on prices. And this is the quote that Dr. Lowe used to explain this. Here he is saying, I'll use my RBA voice, "It is widely accepted that the entry into the global trading system of hundreds of millions of people with access to modern technology put downward pressure on the prices of manufactured goods. Reflecting this, goods prices in the advanced economies have barely increased over the past couple of decades, but the effects of globalization and technology extend beyond this and into almost every corner of the economy, including the services sector." Okay, so globalization, competition, improvements in technology have all put downward pressure on prices and inflation. Okay, so that's the story for today. There will be links below to the governor's speech and also an article by Ross Gittins that looks at this very same topic. The reason why this is important is because when you're writing responses, you need to show that you understand what's happening in the economy right now, and low inflation is the issue. So you now have 3 reasons that you can use to discuss why Australia and the rest of the world has low inflation. All right, questions in the comments, like, dislike, just engage with me. I need that. Okay, and as always, thanks for watching.